Good morning. Hope everybody's doing well today. We finished up John chapter 8 last week. I think, of course, we're in this period of conflict that will last until, at least as far as our text, will last until chapter 11, verse 53. And then we have it down as the period of crisis. But I think to begin a study of John 9, we need to review just a little bit to get our setting. Here's the setting, and this is very quick. I'm not going to go back over everything we've talked about, but chapter 7, verses 40 through 42, you have some confusion among the people. Chapter 7, verses 45 and 46, you have people that were sent to take Jesus, of course, did not. They were amazed at Jesus. Chapter 7, verses 47 through 52, you have we might call it not really logic, illogic of the Pharisees. They attempt this, what we sometimes call poisoning the well, in verse 47 of chapter 7. They just, are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed on him? Well, so what? They're not the authority. That doesn't mean anything. Then Nicodemus tries to reason with them a little bit. He's not a disciple of Jesus per se. He's just trying to use some common decency. And again, they attack him. After he says, "Does our law judge any man before it hears him and knows what he does?" They answered and said, "Are you also of Galilee? Search and look, for out of Galilee ariseth no prophet," which, of course, as we talked about, was false. But again, that's irrelevant. They're just attacking anything and anyone who would dare to disagree with them. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, of course, is the woman taken in adultery. They bring her to Jesus. They conveniently did not bring the man. They're trying to entrap Jesus. Then you have 12 through 18 of chapter 8. Jesus is going to teach further, and you see their blasphemy and at least hinting at it in verse 19 of chapter 8. Then verses 30 through 40 of chapter 8, he talks about truth and bondage. And again, they either conveniently forgot, or maybe they're just being completely 100% dishonest when they say, "We're Abraham's seed and we're never in bondage to any man." They come outright with the blasphemy in verse 41 of chapter 8, when they say, "We be not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God." And so they blaspheme him and try to critique his birth. Then verses 42 through 47 of chapter 8, Jesus will deal very calmly but forthrightly with their blasphemy. 48 through 59 of chapter 8 is further blasphemy and lies from these Pharisees, and Jesus answers. I say all that to set the stage for chapter 9, because when you get to chapter 9, Jesus has had a bad day. It's a bad day. He has been attacked in every way possible, every way imaginable. In fact, even at the end of chapter 8, they take up stones to cast at him, but God does everything in time and on time, so it's not yet time for him to offer himself for the sins of mankind. So he hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Again, I say that just to point out what a day he's had up to this point, and I also, every time I read chapter 9, especially beginning it, here's what I think. Would I be in the mood to help out someone at this point? Not necessarily just simply to help out, but Jesus is going to, you've seen chapter 9, you've no doubt read it before. There's a lengthy interaction here. It's going to boil over. They're going to attack this blind man who is healed. Jesus is not having a good day. And sometimes, even maybe you go somewhere, whether it be, you might go on into downtown Atlanta or somewhere, and maybe you've had a long day, it's frustrating, and the last thing you want is someone coming up, "Could you help me out? Could you give me some money? Could you do this?" And sometimes it's easy to say, no, maybe sometimes it's not even because you're just trying to be unkind. It's just you're so wrapped up in thoughts of what has happened. I've heard a situation one time of a fella had a real bad day, and he was in a smaller town, kind of like Bremen, and he ran into one of the sisters of the congregation at the grocery store and walked right by her and didn't speak, and it really upset her and offended her, and she finally confronted him later about it, and he said, well, he apologized and said, I wasn't trying to be unkind. I'd had such a day up to that point, and I was so frazzled, I just didn't even notice you, and if I had, I would have at least said, hey. But Jesus has had a very, very bad day here. I could see a lot of folks being in a not a very good mood at this point. I think about, would this blind man be of concern to me? I would like to think the answer would be yes. I don't know. I mean, obviously, we're not in the situation. We can't say 100% for certain. But I think a lot of folks, the last thing on their mind is this blind person. But, of course, as you know, Jesus, he's the first thing on Jesus' mind. We sometimes sing the song, Does Jesus Care? And, of course, the chorus says, oh, yes, he cares. I know he cares. His heart is touched with my grief. And, sometimes we have bad days, and it's helpful to try to remember in those situations that even Jesus, on one of his worst days, he's thinking of others. And you see, I don't know that you could find a passage there. There are others that show it equally, I'm sure, but I don't think you could find a passage in the Bible that shows the compassion of God and Jesus more than in John chapter 9. And so here we come to this section. Jesus had a terrible day up to this point. And so as Jesus passed by, he's just passing by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. Again, very easy just to keep right on walking. It's not like the man saw him, he's blind. And so he could very easily just pass right on by. He's busy, he's had a bad day. But the disciples ask him, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Every time I see this, I kind of stop for a second and I say, wait a minute. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? The first option is what? This man. But he was blind from birth. How do you so sin as to be born blind? There were some schools of rabbinical thought that taught reincarnation. Maybe they had this false view of reincarnation, that somehow in a previous life he'd sinned and now he's been sent back as a blind man. The Bible nowhere teaches reincarnation. And so the second option then is his parents. He's because of their sin. But, Ezekiel 18:20 and other verses in the Bible tells the soul that sinneth, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. Sometimes we suffer consequences because of other people's sins. And there can be consequences because of parents sinning, but, they ask the question. And they seem to be thinking that just because either this man sinned or his parents sinned, he's been struck with blindness. And Jesus answered, verse 3, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Sometimes we are, simply put, we're born into a world that is, we sometimes refer to it as a fallen world. And so sometimes in a fallen world, there are people who are born in difficult circumstances. There may be, again, sometimes it's consequences of a parent's choice. There could be smoking, drinking, drugs during pregnancy that can affect a child's health at birth. But what Jesus is saying here is that this particular man is going to be an opportunity for Jesus to show, once again, he is God in the flesh. He is the Christ. It's a chance to show his compassion, and really that's, I don't know if the right word to use is that to say that's ancillary, because the compassion of Jesus is overarching throughout the Gospels, but this is going to be used to testify to his deity, to the fact that he is the Messiah. And right along with that is a chance to show compassion on a man who he's been blind from birth and obviously suffers because of that. Jesus then says, verse 4, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. This is a statement about the work of Jesus and the fact that opportunities are limited. Jesus was God in the flesh. As such, he is eternal. No beginning, no end. And yet, he understood that being incarnate in human flesh, there was a limited time here on this earth. And so he says, I've got to be doing the works of him that sent me while it is day. day representing life and the opportunities here on this earth, because he says the night is coming when no man can work. And that's still true today, isn't it? Opportunities are limited. Time is limited. And so we need to do the works of him that sent us while it is day, because the night is coming when no man can work. Then he goes on and says, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way therefore and washed and came seeing. So Jesus makes this clay and anoints his eyes, and people, sometimes commentators get off on long tangents about why did he do this, why did he choose this, instead of just saying you're healed. Perhaps he wanted to give the man a part to play in this, not to say that he had a part in his healing, but a test. Are you gonna, because some people might not have the faith. They might decide this is ridiculous. What would going washing in a pool have to do? And why are you putting this ridiculous stuff on my eyes here? There could have been all kind of arguments made against that, but maybe that's the point here. But at the end of the day, the Bible doesn't say. And so anything we could guess at would be just that. It would be conjecture. We don't know. We could speculate, but there's really no point in that. But be that as it may, Jesus anoints his eyes with this clay, tells him to go wash in the pool, which I've always thought was kind of ironic. He sends him to go wash in the pool, which is, by interpretation is called sent. And so the man does so. He followed Jesus' instruction, and he comes back seeing. He has his eyesight. The neighbors, therefore, and they which, this is verse 8, they which before had seen him that was blind said, is not this he that sat and begged? Well, they recognize him, and they recognize, they can tell he's not blind anymore. He sees. By the way, this is very interesting because I don't remember all the details, but Dr. Berry at West Georgia Congregation had told me something about if a person, if there are things that can be done when people lose eyesight. Sometimes it's surgery, and of course, cataracts can get to the point where you become basically blind. And a lot of medical missions, that's what they will do. They'll go and, for us, pretty simple cataract removal. But, there was a brother in Childersburg that went down to Panama, I think 2 or 3 times a year, and they would do medical missions a lot. And they would have doctors come down and remove cataracts, and he said there were people who were blind that could see. And he said, I felt like I was, back in the time of Jesus, because here are these people that are blind and now they can see. Sometimes there are other things that can be, it may not be totally reversible, but you can get somebody where they can at least function out of what was essentially blindness. But if a person is blind from birth, there's no way. There's no way to do anything like that. It takes a genuine miracle. And all that's just to say, it again points out the obvious fact here. This is a miracle. This is not some kind of healing salve he puts on the man's eyes and, oh, look, it made him get better. No, this man was blind from birth. And so they recognize him. Some said, verse 9, this is he. Others said, well, he's like him. But he said, the blind man, formerly blind man, I am he. So some people were saying, no, it just looks like him. And, that could happen in any situation where you say, oh, I think that's him. No, it looks like him, but it's not. And so finally the guy puts all doubts to rest and says, I am he. Therefore said they unto him, how were thine eyes opened? Well, obviously this is a pretty amazing thing. If you see a man that was blind since birth and now he sees, your first question is, how'd that happen? He answered and said, a man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed mine eyes and said unto me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received sight. Here's what he told me to do. I did it, and it worked. Then said they unto him, where is he? He said, I know not. Well, they want to question Jesus. Obviously, I think anyone at this point, I don't know if you could necessarily say there's any kind of ill intention. They want to question him. But then they bring to the Pharisees, verse 13, him that aforetime was blind. So, it's always running to the Pharisees. We want to get their opinion. They were the religious elite. Buddy, they wanted to be the elite. They thought of themselves as the elite. And so, everything, it seems like they kind of have this mentality that whatever you do, whatever you think, it needs to go through us first. And so some of these people are just in lockstep with that mentality, and so they bring him to the Pharisees. What does verse 14 say? It was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Boy, they have some real misunderstandings about the Sabbath, don't they? They needed a lot of instruction about what the Sabbath was and what it was intended for, what was allowed, what was not allowed. You see this really even going back into the Old Testament. They had a lot of misunderstanding about the Sabbath. And Nehemiah's time, they're restoring the city, they're restoring the walls, they're restoring the law and all that. And of course, we've been talking about Haggai and Zechariah restoring the temple. But a lot of their misunderstanding there was they wanted to work on the Sabbath. And Nehemiah even goes out at one point, I think it's chapter 13, and he finds people that they're camping outside the city on the Sabbath day. They're just waiting until that exact moment so they can get ready to do business. And they were abusing the Sabbath. And so Nehemiah goes and he runs them off. Here's the other end of that spectrum, where they're taking it to such an extreme that here's a man who obviously is from God, who obviously is God in the flesh, and they're saying, you can't do that. You can't heal somebody on the Sabbath because that's work. It's not work, for one thing. Number two, is anything work for God? I remember my children from a very young age, we would sometimes talk about this, about God creating the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And I wanted to make sure, from a very young age they understood God didn't rest because he was so tired from all that creating. Oh, I need a nap. I'm going to take the seventh day off. It means literally in the Hebrew, he ceased creating. So it's not work for God, number one, or number two. Number one, it wouldn't fall into the category of work. It's not work for God. Nothing is hard or difficult for God. Number three, Jesus is going to point out in other places that if someone has an ox who falls in the ditch on the Sabbath day, what do? You get him out. That was never the intention of the Sabbath, to just completely restrain people and bind people. It was given to man as a day of rest because that's needed. God knows what we need. And so they completely, on another occasion, I want to say Matthew, I'm wanting to say 12, but I'm not sure that's right. But they go through a field, and Jesus' disciples, they grab some, I think the King James has corn, but it's wheat. And so they take it and do a very crude type of threshing where you just kind of rub it in your hands, and then you can just take that and blow the chaff away, and you have the grain. And so they pop a few grains in their mouth and just kind of what we would say just a very light snack. And some of the Pharisees see that, and they say, oh, there you go, you're threshing. You're threshing wheat on the Sabbath day, that's work. You must not be from God. And Jesus points out how ridiculous that logic or again, illogic is. So Jesus heals this man on the Sabbath day, and they're going to be upset about that. I heard a preacher say one time, I don't know, the Bible doesn't tell us for sure, but it does sometimes make you wonder. He said it makes you wonder if Jesus sometimes didn't heal people on the Sabbath just to test them and use it as an opportunity to teach them just how misunderstood, just how wrong their views of the Sabbath were. Yes, sir. And yes, that was, I forgot that one. But yeah, Jesus points out the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. He made the law. He is the very Word of God. And he doesn't use that. Sometimes people use that to say that he's saying, I'll break the law if I want to. That's not what he's saying. He lived and died perfectly in submission to the law of Moses. But at the same time, he says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And so that's a good point as well. So anyway, over and over again, Jesus does things on the Sabbath that they try to criticize and show their ignorance of the law that was given to them so long ago. Verse 15 says, then again the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. They're going to ask him this numerous times. Every time, notice, whenever he's asked or whenever he discusses his healing, how simplistic it is. This is not complicated. This is a matter of seeing a miracle, acknowledging it is a miracle. They got that far. They did acknowledge it's a miracle. Many times they acknowledged it's a miracle. Seeing a miracle, acknowledging it, and accepting the repercussions of that miracle. And that's where they went. They went completely off course because they refused to accept the implications and the repercussions of the miracles of Jesus. And that is to say that the repercussions being they proved he is the Messiah. And so they want to know how he had received his sight. Continuing there in verse 15, he said unto them, he put clay upon mine eyes, and I washed and do see. Well, this is the second time he's explained it. Both times very simplistic. Therefore, verse 16, said some of the Pharisees, this man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Again, I just have to, every time I see that, I think, how do you jump from putting clay upon a man's eyes and telling him to go wash in the pool to saying he's not keeping the Sabbath? You talk about straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. They are fault-finding to the nth degree. Others said, there in the middle of verse 16, how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? Well, some of them had enough sense to reason that out. Wait a minute. How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. Well, you see, there's some division. Sometimes we need to understand, going back Matthew 10, 34 through 36, Jesus says, think not that I'm come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I'm come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes shall be they of his own household. Jesus didn't come for the purpose of division, but what he's saying there is, and you see it borne out right here, sometimes the truth causes division, because there are people who will accept the truth, and there are people who will not. And so if someone refuses to accept the truth, we say, well, God wants unity, so we should just agree to disagree, and we'll get along, and it's okay. And sometimes that's what people want to do, especially in the pluralistic religious world in which we find ourselves. People say, well, we should just ignore those differences, and we should never be ugly about them. Jesus was never unkind, but he never shied away from the truth, and he acknowledged that sometimes there's going to be a division because some folks are not going to follow the truth. So there's a division now among these Jewish folks, and perhaps the text is not 100% clear, but perhaps even among the Pharisees. So now, verse 17, they say unto the blind man again, what sayest thou of him that he hath opened thine eyes? He said, he is a prophet. Well, he's obviously some kind of a prophet, the man says, because he performed this miracle. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. Oh, no. You're lying. You weren't even blind before. You've just been pretending. So they call his parents. They asked them, saying, is this your son, who ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? So they say, is this your son that you claim was born blind? You see, they're kind of insinuating there that maybe they're not being truthful either. The parents, that is. How does he now see? His parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself. So they say, look, and I guess we probably ought to read the next verse. These words spake his parents because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. So they know the consequences of saying, oh, absolutely, this man is clearly a prophet of God, or this man is clearly the Messiah. They know the consequences are they're going to be put out of the synagogue. So again, there's that intimidation factor from the Pharisees. And so the parents say, look, we don't really want to get involved in this. And I mean, do you not just feel terrible for this man throughout this whole account? His own parents are kind of hanging him out to dry. And they say, look, all we know is that he is our son. And yes, he was born blind. But I mean, really, how it happened, we don't know. We weren't there. So, and again, I just keep coming back to, if a man is born blind and he's been blind for all that time and now he sees, there is no, well, I don't really know how that happened. It's a miracle. There is no other explanation. But they don't want to say that because they don't want to be put out of the synagogue. So they say, look, we know it's our son and we know he was born blind, but how that happened, as far as him being able to see now, we don't know. What probably the best thing is if you just go ask him. It's like they're saying, if anybody's going to get kicked out, let it be him. We don't want to be kicked out of the synagogue. If he wants to do that to himself, then so be it. But they're afraid. And hold your spot. Go to chapter 12. Familiar verses. But you see the same kind of mentality as what his parents had here in chapter 12. Somebody read 42 and 43, please, of chapter 12. Okay, so even among some of the chief rulers, you've got some folks that they've come to the obvious, unavoidable conclusion: Jesus is the Christ. He's the Messiah. He is the one who's been prophesied to come into the world to save people from their sins. They see it, they acknowledge it, but they say, let's just kind of have our little secret group over here, and we're not going to say anything about it openly because we don't want to get put out of the synagogue. The Pharisees, just, again, every time I read it, I'm just amazed at how stubborn and prideful they are, even to go as far as they go right here in chapter 9. Verse 23 continues, therefore, in other words, that's why his parents said he's of age, ask him. Now, verse 24, then again called they the man that was blind, and said unto him, give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. You talk about blasphemy. They call the Son of God a man who just did an incontrovertible miracle, and they say, we know he's a sinner. You give God the praise. It's like they want to say that just he was struck from heaven and given sight all of a sudden. But anything to avoid saying Jesus did this by the power of God. So they say, just give God the praise. We know this man is a sinner. And this man, this formerly blind man, he doesn't miss a beat. And you got to admire his courage here, even in the face of such opposition and such nastiness from these Pharisees. And he says, whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. He says, hey man, I know the facts. I couldn't see a thing, and now I can see just fine. So you do the math. Then said they to him again, what did he to thee? How opened he thine eyes? They ask him again. Tell us how this happened. And I love his answer. He really gives it to him here, and he's not shying away. He answered them, I have told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? Ooh, man. Don't you know that's going to sting him? You've asked me once, and I've told you. You want to hear it again. Are you mulling things over? Are you thinking about becoming his disciple? He knew better than that. He's taking a little stab at them. Not out of nastiness, but he's trying to get them, even this man, trying to get them to see how foolish they're being, how illogical they're being in all of this. Will you also be his disciple? Then they reviled him and said, thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. Didn't Moses say, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you like unto me? Unto him shall you hearken in all things. Wasn't that Moses who said that, Deuteronomy 18? It was. Over and over again, the law of Moses, and when they say we're Moses' disciples, they're talking about the law of Moses. The law of Moses over and over again prophesied the birth, the life, the teaching, the gentleness, the meekness, and on about the Christ. And Jesus fulfills them all. We've talked before about the astronomical odds of Jesus fulfilling even just a handful of those prophecies, and yet he fulfills them all. And it's right there before their eyes, and they refuse to believe. So they revile this man. That's classic ad hominem stuff. That's the I guess it's a Latin term, I'm not really sure, but it's used in logic. When you can't answer the argument, you have two choices. You can either concede and say, well, I was wrong, and God bless those people with the humility and the character and integrity to do so when they are wrong. Or number two option is you attack the man. And it still happens to this day. Sometimes people can't answer an argument, and they will turn like a rabid dog on you. I've had it happen to me. Several years ago, it was like an email list or something, and some guys were discussing things, and I noticed that some things were being said that were just not true. They were, in fact, some of them involved an older preacher who was not on the internet, and they were just completely misrepresenting what he had said. And I thought, this isn't right. And I thought, these people, they can't know what he said. I was, quite honestly, I was pretty naive about it, because that's what I honestly thought. I thought they just don't know, and when they hear the facts, they'll change. And so I got on the list and started sending some messages, and I was saying, hey, y'all need to know this is not, I don't know how this got misrepresented like this, but that's not how this happened. That's not what this brother said. And all of a sudden, they turned on me, and someone else spoke up and tried to reason, and they turned on them, and they ended up kicking us both off their little email list because we dared to speak up and say, hey, here's what happened in that situation. But it still happens. Sometimes you'll see it in debates. People get together, and the idea is, let's study and see what the Bible says about this. Maybe it's a debate on baptism or the one church or whatever. And sometimes when a fellow hears the truth, instead of accepting it, he'll begin to attack the person. And so they just turn on this man, and they revile him, and they say, oh, you're his disciple. We're Moses' disciples. Verse 29, they say, we know that God spake unto Moses. As for this fellow, talking about Jesus, we know not from whence he is. He had told them over and over from where he came and where he was going. They just refused to believe it. They say, oh, we know where this fellow, talking about Jesus, that derogatory term, this fellow, we know where he's from. That's the boy who grew up in Nazareth. We all know about him. Nothing mysterious there. But the evidence was there. They just refused to see it. You going to say something, Bill?
I find it amazing how people over the years have taken exact words from the scriptures and made songs out of them. And this is one of those amazing grace.
Yeah. I was blind, but now I see. And that's what this fella says. And in fact, Jesus is going to use that comparison at the end of the chapter, talk about blindness, and he's not talking about physical blindness. He's talking about spiritual blindness. And here are people that, these Pharisees, they can see quite well physically, but they're blind as a bat, as we say, spiritually speaking. So, we know that God spake unto Moses. As for this fellow, we know not from whence he is, they say. The man answered and said, hey, he's going to take another stab at him here. And again, he's not trying to just, verbally spar with them. He's not just trying to mix it up. I think he's a bit confused and amazed at their stubbornness and their hard-heartedness. And so he says, why, herein is a marvelous thing, that you know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, it was not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind. If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. I say, the fellow says, this is pretty amazing, guys. I mean, you are scholars, and you're so knowledgeable in the law of Moses, and you say you don't know where this guy's from, but he opened my eyes. I was blind from birth. God doesn't hear sinners. We all know that. It's not even been heard of that somebody should open the eyes of the blind. If he were not of God, how could he do any of this? He reasoned it out. Was it complicated? Just required a little bit of open mind, which they had none of. Verse 31 is sometimes people debate over this and talk about, sometimes it comes up in the discussion of the sinner's prayer. I think, one thing to remember here with verse 31, this man speaking is not inspired. The recording of his words is inspired. John was inspired to record the words. This man speaking is not inspired. However, it is a true statement. God doesn't hear sinners. And sometimes people immediately say, well, what about Cornelius? Cornelius was a man who was seeking God's will. And Cornelius' prayers came up for a memorial before God. And so, we've talked about this before, and I don't want to rehash that whole discussion. Obviously, God hears everything. But there's a special attentiveness that God gives to the prayers of his children. But the point here is, don't lose the point in that discussion, in that debate. Don't lose the point here that what this guy is saying is, he's obviously from God. If he tries to heal someone and God's not listening to him, because as you say, he's some kind of a sinner, then how could he perform this miracle? You know, he's making a logical point here, trying to, and sometimes that's, you know, it's an all-day affair trying to reason, and it's an all-day futile affair trying to reason with people who are unreasonable. But he's trying to reason with them and say, look, God doesn't hear sinners. If this man were a sinner, as you say, he could not have healed my blindness. And so they say, well, you know, that's a good point, and they believe on Jesus. You know that's not how it goes. Not with these folks. They answered in verse 34 and said unto him, Thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. You know, that just is a microcosm of their pride and their arrogance. You can't teach us anything. Don't sit here and try to teach us. You're the one that was born in sin. See, they take that position now too. Oh, you're the one born in sin, and you're going to come and try to teach us, huh, Mr. Sinner? Get out. And so they cast him out. All he tried to do was reason with them. So they accuse him. They've reviled him. They've accused him of being born in sin. They've acted like he has nothing to teach them. You know, that still happens today, doesn't it? I have known people, I've known of preachers and maybe college professors who act like no one can teach me anything. And you know, I've learned stuff from little children. I think all of us have. You know, in fact, it was Jesus himself who said, a little child shall lead them, quoting from Isaiah. The idea that I don't have anything to learn from anybody is foolish, and it's prideful, and it's just dead wrong. I remember one time, I don't know, it sticks out in my mind, talking about learning from a child. The first church work I ever did was at Ironton, where Cliff Goodwin is now in Talladega, and Tracy Moore was the preacher, and his little boy Lex was about 2 years old, and I remember very well, Lex and I had the same birthday, August 27th, just a few years apart. He was born on my 16th birthday, so yeah, he would have been 2 years old at this time, or getting right at 2, and so Tracy was working on his sermon. I was just doing youth work there with the congregation part-time, and I happened to be down at the building one day. It was during summer, and so I wasn't in college at the time, and so Tracy said, hey, I'm going to go into the auditorium, and I want to go over my sermon. Could you sit here with Lex for just a little bit and keep an eye on him? I said, sure, I'd be glad to. And so I was sitting there with Lex, and we're just kind of talking and goofing off, and so Lex gets to wanting to go outside, and this is something like June or July. He wants to go outside and play. And I said, no, we can't do that. I didn't want to go out there and get all sweaty and get him nasty and all this. I said, we can't do that. He says, come on, let's go outside. I said, well, it's hot outside, Lex. And he says, you mean you don't like the sun? And I said, yeah, that's right. That sun's hot. And he just looked at me, and his eyes were wide, and he was just so shocked. And he says, but God made the sun. And it left me kind of backpedaling, you know. So sometimes a child can teach you. Even a 2-year-old child can teach you quite a bit. But they had this attitude, you can't teach us. We're the authority. We're the experts. And I heard of even a college professor one time. He was in a Christian college, so-called, and someone questioned him on something. He was teaching something that was clearly wrong. It went directly against what the Bible said, and a student raised his hand. And you know what the fellow said? He said, excuse me, son. And the guy wasn't disrespectful. I understand the guy could have disagreed in a way that was wrong, but he did not. And other people who were in the class, you know, affirmed that he did not. And he says, son, what is your degree? Well, I have a bachelor's degree. He says, well, I am a PhD, so I'll thank you to sit down and shut up. That's that same kind of mentality of the Pharisees. And I'm going to tell you something. I'm just going to say it plain. It's Bible. You can't go to heaven with that kind of mentality. You cannot go to heaven with that kind of pride and arrogance. Let's continue very quickly. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he found him, he said unto him, Dost thou believe on the Son of God? He answered and said, Who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? Again, Jesus had a bad day, and he goes and he finds this man. They've cast him out, and Jesus goes looking for him. The compassion of God in Jesus here is just astounding. He answers and says, Who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? Jesus said unto him, Thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, For judgment I am come into this world, that they which see not might see. They which see not physically might see. And they which see physically might be made blind spiritually. And some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words and said unto him, Are we blind also? And Jesus said unto them, If you were blind, just blind physically, you should have no sin. But now you say, We see. spiritually. That's that pride. We know it all. Now you say, we see, therefore your sin remaineth. Jesus lets them know in no uncertain terms, as I just said, you cannot go to heaven with that type of mentality. We'll stop there. Lord willing, Brother Bob's going to fill in next Sunday and take up Jesus talking about being the door, the good shepherd, and he's going to continue to show his compassion as he talks about what the good shepherd does for his sheep, those who are willing to hear him and follow his voice. Thank you so much for your time and attention.